The morning began the way every morning began at the federal courthouse downtown, with the smell of fresh coffee drifting through the marble corridors and the soft click of polished shoes against stone floors. Outside, the city had only just begun to wake. Delivery trucks idling along the curb, commuters hurrying past the wide stone steps without sparing the building a second glance, unaware that within a few hours, its hallways would be carrying a story that would travel far beyond the four walls of any single courtroom. Lawyers in tailored suits moved in clusters, trading gossip and laughter, their voices echoing off the high ceilings of the building that had seen decades of verdicts handed down and lives changed forever. The kind of institutional grandeur designed to remind every visitor that what happened inside these walls mattered, that the decisions rendered here carried weight long after the people who made them had gone home for the evening. Among them stood Richard Calloway, a defense attorney whose name appeared in legal journals more often than most judges did, a man who carried himself like he owned the very air inside the room, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, his suit cut with the precision of someone who understood that appearance, in certain circles, mattered nearly as much as argument. Beside him walked Diane Foster, his longtime colleague, nodding along to whatever he said, laughing at jokes that were not particularly funny, but that she laughed at anyway, because that was simply how things worked around Richard, a dynamic the two of them had settled into years earlier and never once questioned. He had a way of making every courtroom feel like his personal stage, and on this particular morning, before the session even began, he was already telling a younger associate that there was not a judge in this building he could not read within the first 5 minutes of a hearing. That experience had taught him exactly how to tilt a room in his favor before opposing counsel had even opened their files. Diane chuckled and agreed, because she always agreed, and the two of them strolled toward courtroom 4 with the easy confidence of people who had never once doubted their place in the world, their footsteps unhurried, their conversation light, utterly unaware that the next several hours would dismantle every assumption either of them carried into that room. It was at that exact moment that a woman walked through the heavy wooden doors, dressed in a vest that had clearly seen better years, her hair pulled back simply, her expression calm and unreadable. She carried no briefcase, no stack of files balanced precariously against her hip, only a single worn folder tucked beneath her arm, and there was nothing about her entrance that suggested she expected to be noticed at all. She moved without hurry, without the performative swagger so many lawyers wore like cologne, and she took a seat near the front, near the area typically reserved for counsel, choosing the chair closest to the aisle, as though she had sat in that exact spot 100 times before and felt no particular need to draw attention to herself. She opened her folder, scanned through some papers, and said nothing to anyone, her eyes moving steadily across the page in front of her, occasionally pausing to make a small note in the margin with a pen she produced from an inside pocket. Richard glanced at her once, then again, and something about her presence irritated him in a way he could not quite explain, perhaps because she did not fit the picture he had already painted of who belonged in this room and who did not, perhaps because her composure unsettled him in a manner he was not accustomed to encountering from strangers. He leaned toward Diane and murmured something about family members of defendants always trying to sit in the wrong section, and Diane gave a small laugh in response, the two of them exchanging a glance that suggested they had already decided, without a single word from the woman herself, exactly who she was and what she was worth. Nobody in the gallery paid much attention, because nobody yet understood that this quiet woman in the worn vest was about to upend everything they thought they knew about that morning, that within the span of a single hour, the entire balance of power inside that courtroom would shift in a direction none of them could have predicted. Richard, never one to let an assumption go unspoken, walked directly toward her chair, his shadow falling over the folder she was reading. He told her, in a tone that suggested he was doing her a favor by even speaking to her, that she needed to stand and find a seat in the back, because this area was reserved for attorneys. The woman looked up at him, her eyes steady, and replied simply that she was waiting for her hearing to begin. Richard scoffed, the corner of his mouth curling into something close to a smirk, and said that everyone in the building was waiting for something, as if her explanation meant nothing at all. Without waiting for a further response, he reached down and swept the folder off the seat beside her, the papers sliding loudly onto the floor, and in the same motion, his hand struck her shoulder hard enough that she had to catch herself against the armrest to keep from losing her balance. A few heads turned in the gallery. A young court reporter froze mid-step, but nobody said a word, because nobody wanted to be the one to challenge Richard Calloway in his own territory. And the silence that followed was the kind that makes a room feel smaller than it actually is. Marcus Hale, the bailiff stationed near the side wall, had seen plenty of friction unfold in this courthouse over the years. Impatient attorneys snapping at clerks, frustrated visitors raising their voices. When a hearing ran late, and his instinct in that moment was to treat this as nothing more than another instance of the same tired pattern. He noted the commotion, registered the raised voice, and made a mental decision that intervention was unnecessary, that the woman would either find another seat or quietly accept Richard's correction, the way most people did when confronted by someone speaking with that particular blend of authority and condescension. He did not yet understand that his hesitation, like the silence of everyone else in that gallery, would later feel like a small failure when measured against what the morning would ultimately reveal. For now, he simply turned his attention back toward the door, watching for the next group of attorneys due to arrive, unaware that the woman he had just dismissed from his concern was about to become the most important person in that entire building. What struck the few onlookers who did notice was not the woman's reaction, but her lack of one. She did not raise her voice. She did not demand an apology. She simply knelt down, gathered her scattered papers one by one, straightened them against her knee, and placed them back into the folder with the same unhurried calm she had carried since she first walked through those doors. Richard, emboldened by her silence, took it as confirmation of everything he already believed about her, and he turned to the small audience that had gathered to watch the morning's proceedings and announced, loud enough for several rows to hear, that this courtroom was reserved for people with proper credentials, for people who understood the rules of the institution. A ripple of laughter moved through a cluster of junior associates standing near the wall, the kind of laughter that comes from wanting to be on the winning side of a joke rather than truly finding it funny. One reporter, sensing something worth capturing, quietly lifted her phone and began recording, though she could not have said exactly why she felt the pull to do so. The court bailiff, a heavy-set man named Marcus Hale, glanced over at the commotion but assumed it was nothing more than an ordinary disagreement, the kind he had seen unfold 100 times before between impatient lawyers and confused visitors. He returned his attention to his clipboard, missing the full weight of what had just happened. The woman, meanwhile, simply rose, smoothed her vest, and resumed her seat as though the incident had cost her nothing at all. For the gallery, the strangeness of her composure became its own kind of mystery. A retired schoolteacher seated 2 rows back leaned toward her husband and whispered that she had never seen anyone absorb such public humiliation without so much as a flicker of anger crossing their face. Diane, still standing beside Richard, found herself studying the woman more closely now, an uneasy feeling beginning to take root somewhere beneath her practiced smile, though she could not yet name what was bothering her. Richard, riding the high of his own performance, continued holding court among his small audience, recounting a case he had won the previous month, his voice booming with the kind of confidence that filled every corner of the room. He believed, as he always did, that he had already won this morning before a single official proceeding had even begun, that the quiet woman in the back had been put properly in her place and would cause no further disruption to his day. He could not have known how wrong that assumption would prove to be within the span of a few short minutes. The murmurs in the gallery had not yet died down when the heavy doors at the rear of the chamber creaked open and a different kind of stillness settled over the room, the kind that precedes something official. The bailiff straightened his posture. The court reporter set down her tablet and folded her hands. Richard, still mid-sentence with one of his colleagues, barely registered the shift in atmosphere, too absorbed in his own anecdote to notice that the air itself seemed to be holding its breath. Diane, however, felt it immediately, a prickling awareness that something was about to happen that would matter far more than the small drama of the folder and the shoulder and the laughter that had followed it. She glanced toward the front of the room, toward the raised platform where the judge's chair sat empty, polished wood gleaming under the overhead lights, waiting. The clerk's voice rang out clear and formal, instructing everyone in the chamber to rise, and the shuffle of bodies standing in unison filled the room with a brief wave of sound before settling into silence again. Richard rose along with everyone else, still wearing the faint, satisfied smile of a man who believed his morning had gone exactly as planned. He did not even look toward the side door through which the presiding judge would enter, his attention instead drifting toward Diane, ready to share one more remark about the woman they had dismissed only minutes earlier. It was in that small window of distraction that the side door opened, and the very same woman in the worn vest stepped through it, moving with the unhurried grace she had carried since the moment she first walked into the gallery, except now she was no longer heading toward a seat near the front. She was walking toward the bench. A black robe settled over her shoulders as she crossed the final few steps, the fabric falling into place as though it had always belonged there, as though the vest underneath had simply been a temporary disguise waiting to be shed. The clerk's voice rose again, announcing the arrival of the Honorable Judge Amara Brooks, and the words landed in the chamber like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward until they reached every single person who had witnessed what happened only minutes before. Richard's smile did not fade gradually. It collapsed all at once, the color draining from his face as the full weight of recognition crashed over him, the realization arriving far too late to undo what he had already done. Diane's hand rose involuntarily to cover her mouth, her eyes wide, her mind racing backward through every word Richard had spoken, every laugh she had offered in agreement, every moment she could have intervened and chose instead to stay silent. The young court reporter who had quietly filmed the earlier exchange lowered her phone slightly, her thumb still pressed against the record button. Her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something close to satisfaction. Around the gallery, the same pattern repeated itself in face after face, confusion giving way to astonishment, astonishment giving way to a kind of breathless anticipation, because everyone in that room now understood that the woman who had been shoved out of her seat, mocked in front of strangers, and dismissed as someone who did not belong, was about to preside over the very proceedings in which Richard Calloway was scheduled to argue his case. Judge Brooks settled into her chair behind the bench, arranged a small stack of papers in front of her with the same calm precision she had shown while gathering her folder off the floor earlier that morning, and lifted her eyes to survey the courtroom before her, her gaze passing briefly, deliberately, over Richard, before moving on to address the room as a whole. The silence that followed was not the awkward silence of confusion, but something heavier, the silence of people realizing they had just watched a story begin that they desperately wanted to see finished. Richard attempted to recover his composure the moment the formal proceedings opened, clearing his throat and offering a brief, mumbled apology in the general direction of the bench, the kind of half-hearted gesture meant more to save face than to express genuine remorse. Judge Brooks looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before responding simply that the court was ready to proceed, with no further mention of the incident from earlier that morning. To Richard, this felt like a reprieve, a sign that the matter had been quietly set aside, that professionalism would prevail and the case would move forward as though nothing unusual had occurred at all. He straightened his tie, exchanged a relieved glance with Diane, and began organizing his notes with the renewed confidence of a man who believed he had narrowly escaped consequence. What he failed to understand, in that moment of false relief, was that Judge Brooks was not a woman who forgot, nor one who needed to raise her voice to make her presence felt. She was, instead, someone who watched, who listened, who absorbed every detail of how a person carried themselves under pressure, filing it away for the moment it would matter most. The case itself involved a contractual dispute between two former business partners, the kind of proceeding that rarely drew much public attention but carried significant financial stakes for both parties involved. The plaintiff, a soft-spoken man named Walter Higgins, had built a small logistics company from nothing over the course of 15 years, only to watch his former partner quietly siphon clients and contracts into a competing venture launched under a different name. Richard represented the defendant, a businessman accused of breaching an agreement that had cost his former partner a substantial sum of money. And, as the hearing progressed, his approach to the courtroom revealed itself in ways that went far beyond the earlier incident with the folder. He interrupted opposing counsel mid-sentence on 3 separate occasions within the first half hour, each time offering a clipped apology that carried no real sincerity behind it, the kind of reflexive courtesy lawyers learn to perform without ever truly meaning. He addressed the plaintiff's primary witness with a tone bordering on condescension, phrasing his questions in ways designed less to extract truth and more to fluster and confuse, asking the same question 3 different ways in rapid succession until the witness, a soft-spoken bookkeeper, began stumbling over her own previously clear answers. Judge Brooks intervened quietly, but firmly each time, reminding him of proper courtroom procedure, her voice never rising, her authority never in question, simply stating that the witness would be permitted to finish her answer before the next question was posed. Richard adjusted his behavior temporarily after each correction, nodding with exaggerated cooperation, before slipping back into the same pattern minutes later, but the underlying pattern remained. A man accustomed to dominating every room he entered, through sheer force of personality, now finding himself in front of someone who refused to be moved by that force, no matter how many times he tested the boundaries of her patience. As the morning stretched into early afternoon, the proceedings began to reveal cracks in the foundation of Richard's case, cracks that had likely always been there, but had simply never been examined this closely by anyone willing to push back. He presented a series of financial records meant to support his client's version of events, the numbers laid out with the kind of polished confidence that had carried him through countless prior hearings. But under cross-examination from opposing counsel, inconsistencies began surfacing in the timeline he had constructed. Dates did not align with the documents he had submitted. A key email he referenced turned out to have been paraphrased, rather than quoted directly, the actual wording subtly different from what he had claimed in his opening remarks. A small discrepancy that opposing counsel seized upon with quiet precision. Judge Brooks, reviewing the submitted exhibits with the same unhurried attention she gave to everything, asked for the original source documents rather than the summaries Richard had provided, her request delivered without any visible irritation, simply a clear and reasonable expectation. He hesitated, shuffling through his files with visibly increasing tension, his fingers moving faster than necessary across pages he had clearly not anticipated, needing to revisit, before admitting that the original documents would need to be retrieved from his office. The admission landed heavily in the room, the first visible crack in a performance that had, until that point, seemed entirely seamless. The gallery, still buzzing quietly with the memory of the morning's incident, watched this unfold, with a growing sense that the man who had so confidently humiliated a stranger only hours earlier was beginning to lose his footing in front of everyone. The irony of his unraveling not lost on a single person seated in that room. What became clear to the handful of observers paying close attention was that Richard's reputation as an unbeatable courtroom presence had never truly rested on superior legal skill. It rested instead on intimidation, on his ability to fluster opposing witnesses and pressure less experienced attorneys into folding under the weight of his confidence. He had built an entire career on the assumption that most people in the room, including many judges, preferred to avoid confrontation, rather than challenge a man who spoke with such unwavering certainty. Judge Brooks, however, operated according to an entirely different set of priorities. She did not care how loudly someone spoke or how many cases they had won in the past. She cared only about whether the evidence in front of her held together under scrutiny, and as the afternoon wore on, it became increasingly apparent that Richard's case, much like his earlier behavior in the gallery, had been built on assumptions rather than substance. 20 years before that morning, a much younger Amara Brooks had sat in courtrooms, not as a judge but as a junior attorney, fighting for every inch of respect she could earn, often against partners and senior counsel who looked at her the way Richard had looked at her only hours earlier. She remembered, with a clarity that never seemed to fade, no matter how many years passed, the first time a senior partner told her directly that she simply did not fit the image of what a courtroom lawyer should look like, the words delivered with the same casual cruelty Richard had shown that morning, as though they were simply stating an obvious fact rather than inflicting a wound. She remembered the law firm's annual gathering, where she had stood near the edge of the room for an entire evening because no one approached to introduce themselves, and the deliberate way certain partners had steered prospective clients toward her white male colleagues, even when she had prepared the underlying research herself. She remembered losing a promotion to a far less qualified colleague, a man 2 years out of law school who had spent more time on the golf course than in the library. Remembered the quiet suggestion from a mentor that perhaps litigation was not the right path for her, that perhaps she would find more success in a quieter corner of the legal field where she would not have to fight so hard to be taken seriously. She remembered all of it, not with bitterness, but with the kind of clear-eyed memory that shapes a person's entire approach to their work, every slight catalogued and converted, over time, into something closer to fuel than wound. Rather than retreating from those early humiliations, Amara had used them as fuel for a discipline that few of her peers could match. She studied late into the night, long after her colleagues had gone home, memorizing case law until it became second nature, until she could anticipate arguments before opposing counsel had finished raising them, filling notebook after notebook, with annotations that her professors would later describe as the most thorough they had encountered in years of teaching. She earned a scholarship that allowed her to pursue advanced legal studies, graduating at the top of a class that had once doubted whether she belonged in it at all, the same classmates who had once questioned her presence eventually lining up to borrow her notes before final examinations. She moved into a position as a prosecutor, where she built a reputation, not for theatrical courtroom displays, but for meticulous preparation, for an almost unsettling ability to anticipate every possible defense before it was raised, securing conviction after conviction, not through intimidation, but through the simple, relentless accumulation of irrefutable detail. Colleagues who once underestimated her began seeking her counsel instead, quietly approaching her office door with questions they would never have admitted needing, answered a few years earlier, and eventually, after years of quiet, relentless excellence, she was appointed to the federal bench, a position she approached not as a reward for past struggles, but as a responsibility to ensure that the courtroom remained a place where evidence and integrity mattered more than reputation or intimidation. She had never sought this position as a means of settling old scores. She had sought it because she understood, more intimately than most, how easily the scales of justice could tip in favor of those who simply spoke the loudest, and she had promised herself, long before she ever wore the robe, that she would never allow her own courtroom to operate that way. By mid-afternoon, the cracks in Richard's composure had widened into something far more difficult to hide. He raised objection after objection, with increasingly thin legal grounding, each one overruled by Judge Brooks with the same calm efficiency she had shown all day. His voice, once smooth and commanding, began carrying an edge of frustration that betrayed the confidence he had walked in with that morning. He spoke over opposing counsel again, this time drawing a direct and unmistakable warning from the bench, Judge Brooks reminding him in clear terms that further interruptions would not be tolerated. A second instance followed less than 20 minutes later, drawing a sharper rebuke, her tone still even but carrying a weight that silenced the room far more effectively than any raised voice could have. Reporters seated in the gallery, the same ones who had documented countless high-profile cases over the years, found themselves scribbling notes with unusual urgency, sensing that the story unfolding in front of them had grown into something far larger than a routine contractual dispute. The third warning arrived after Richard attempted to introduce a piece of testimony that opposing counsel objected to as both irrelevant and improperly obtained. Judge Brooks called both attorneys to a brief sidebar, her voice low but firm, and when the proceedings resumed, Richard's demeanor had shifted entirely. The easy confidence that had carried him through years of courtroom victories now looked brittle, stretched thin across a face that could no longer hide the panic, beginning to set in beneath the surface. Diane, seated near him at the defense table, no longer offered the easy laughter she had shared with him that morning. She sat rigid, her eyes fixed on the documents in front of her, increasingly aware that whatever unfolded next was likely to reflect on her as well, given how visibly she had aligned herself with Richard's behavior from the very start of the day. It was shortly after the third warning that Judge Brooks introduced a piece of evidence that none of the observers in the gallery had anticipated, an email exchange that had not been part of the original case file submitted that morning. She explained, in measured and deliberate tones, that the document had come to the court's attention through proper channels during a recess, forwarded by an associate at Richard's own firm who had grown uneasy enough with what she had seen to bring it forward, and that it appeared to directly contradict statements Richard had made earlier in his presentation. The email revealed correspondence between Richard and a witness scheduled to testify later that day, correspondence that suggested an attempt to shape the witness's account of events in a manner favorable to his client, an act that, if proven, would constitute a serious breach of legal ethics. Judge Brooks read a portion of the exchange into the record herself, her voice flat and unembellished, allowing the words themselves to carry whatever weight they deserved without any dramatic inflection on her part, a choice that somehow made the content land even harder than if she had delivered it with outrage. A second document followed shortly after, a record showing that certain financial statements submitted as evidence had been altered in ways that conveniently strengthened the defense's position while obscuring details that would have favored the plaintiff, the alterations subtle enough to escape casual review, but glaring once placed side by side with the original figures. Walter Higgins, seated at the plaintiff's table, pressed a hand against his mouth as the documents were read aloud, the months of frustration and self-doubt he had carried since the dispute began finally giving way to something closer to vindication. His own attorney, a younger man who had spent the morning bracing for a difficult outcome, sat utterly still, watching the unraveling unfold with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and quiet relief. The gallery, hushed since the first mention of the email, seemed to lean forward collectively, every person in the room recalculating everything they thought they understood about the man who had walked in that morning radiating absolute certainty. The gallery, already attentive after hours of mounting tension, fell into something close to total silence as these documents were read into the official record. Richard's attempts to explain the discrepancies grew increasingly tangled, his usually fluid speech fracturing into fragmented sentences as he struggled to account for inconsistencies he had clearly never expected anyone to notice, let alone expose so thoroughly. Judge Brooks allowed him the opportunity to respond, as procedure required, but her questions cut through his explanations with surgical precision, each one narrowing the space in which he could maneuver until there was nowhere left for him to retreat. The man who had walked into the courtroom that morning convinced he understood every judge within these walls, now found himself utterly unable to read the one sitting in front of him, because Judge Brooks had never operated according to the assumptions he relied on. She had built her entire career resisting exactly the kind of intimidation he specialized in, and no amount of practiced confidence could shake loose the foundation she had spent 2 decades constructing. By the time the final arguments concluded, the courtroom had transformed entirely from the light-hearted, almost dismissive atmosphere of the early morning into something far more solemn, the weight of what had unfolded settling over everyone present. Judge Brooks took a brief recess to review her notes, and when she returned to deliver her ruling, the room had grown so quiet that the soft rustle of her papers seemed almost loud by comparison. She announced, in clear and unhurried language, that the falsified financial documents would be excluded from the official record, rendering a significant portion of the defense's argument inadmissible, and that the underlying contractual dispute would be resolved substantially in favor of the plaintiff, based on the evidence that remained credible and properly documented. She further stated that the evidence of witness tampering would be formally referred to the appropriate disciplinary board responsible for overseeing attorney conduct, a process that carried the potential for serious professional consequences, including suspension or permanent disbarment, depending on the board's findings, and that a transcript of the day's proceedings, along with the relevant documents, would accompany that referral in full. She spoke without raising her voice even once, without allowing a single trace of satisfaction or vindication to color her delivery, because she understood that the moment called for precision rather than triumph, that the law itself properly applied, needed no embellishment to carry its full weight. Richard attempted, one final time, to offer some form of explanation, his voice noticeably smaller than it had been that morning. The polished cadence that had once filled this same room, now reduced to something halting and uncertain. But Judge Brooks simply looked at him and stated, with the same calm certainty she had carried throughout the entire proceeding, that the courtroom was not a place where power was permitted to stand above the law, and that this principle applied equally to every person who walked through its doors, regardless of reputation, regardless of how many cases they had won before, regardless of how confidently they assumed they understood the room they had entered. The words landed with a finality that left no room for further argument, and Richard sank back into his chair, the silence around him deafening in its completeness. Diane stared down at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes, the realization settling over her that her own complicity, however passive it had seemed at the time, had not gone unnoticed either. Reporters in the gallery exchanged glances, already composing in their minds the stories they would file before the end of the day, stories that would carry far beyond the walls of this single courtroom. The bailiff, who had dismissed the morning's incident as nothing more than ordinary friction between strangers, now understood with painful clarity exactly what he had witnessed and failed to act upon, a recognition that would linger with him long after the day's proceedings ended. When the session finally adjourned, Richard gathered his files in silence, his movements slower and more deliberate than the brisk efficiency he had displayed that morning. Each folder placed into his briefcase with the careful precision of a man trying to hold together something that had already shattered. No colleagues approached to offer congratulations or commiseration. No junior associates lingered near him hoping to bask in his presence the way they had only hours earlier. The same young attorneys who had laughed at his jokes that morning, now finding sudden reasons to be elsewhere. Diane left through a side exit without a word to him, her earlier eagerness to align herself with his confidence now replaced by a clear desire to distance herself from the entire affair, her phone already buzzing with messages from colleagues, asking what exactly had happened inside that courtroom. The footage captured earlier by the young court reporter began circulating before the day had even fully ended, spreading first among legal circles, and then far beyond them, each new viewer arriving at the same conclusion that those present in the courtroom had reached hours before, watching the moment of the shove, followed inevitably by the announcement of the judge's name, the two images colliding in a way that needed no further commentary to land its point. It was never the physical shove that ultimately destroyed Richard's reputation, devastating as that moment had been. It was the arrogance that followed it, the absolute certainty that status and bravado could substitute for genuine respect and rigorous integrity, an assumption that crumbled entirely the moment it met someone who refused to be defined by anyone else's judgment, someone who had spent 20 years preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation without ever once seeking it out. Judge Brooks left the courthouse later that evening through the same quiet corridor she had walked through that morning, her pace unhurried, her expression settled into the same calm composure that had carried her through every difficult moment of the day. The worn vest she had worn that morning, now folded neatly inside her bag, replaced for the walk home by a simple coat against the evening chill. As she approached the exit, a young woman in a modest blazer stepped forward, clearly hesitant but determined, introducing herself as Lisa Monroe, a first-year attorney who had been observing the proceedings from the back of the gallery for an unrelated matter scheduled later that afternoon, one that had been delayed long enough for her to witness everything that unfolded in courtroom 4. She told Judge Brooks, her voice trembling slightly with emotion, that watching the events of that day had reminded her why she had entered this profession in the first place, that she had spent months quietly doubting whether she truly belonged in rooms filled with people who seemed so certain of their own superiority, rooms where her own contributions in meetings were so often spoken over or quietly credited to someone else. She explained that she had nearly left the profession twice in her first year alone, that the constant performance of confidence required by so many of her colleagues felt like a language she had never quite learned to speak fluently. She thanked the judge for showing her, in the clearest possible terms, that quiet competence could outlast any amount of performative confidence, that the version of herself she had been trying so hard to suppress in order to fit in might, in fact, be exactly the version capable of succeeding in this field. Judge Brooks studied the young woman for a long moment, recognizing in her something of her own younger self. The same uncertainty, the same quiet determination, simmering just beneath the surface. The same exhausted hope of someone who had not yet decided whether this profession would break her or shape her into something stronger. She told Lisa that the law had never been particularly interested in who shouted loudest, no matter how often it appeared that way from the outside, that the appearance of dominance was so often mistaken for actual command of the facts, and that the two things were rarely the same. She explained briefly that she had once sat exactly where Lisa now stood, uncertain whether her own voice would ever carry weight in rooms built by people who had never expected to share them, and that the answer, 20 years later, had turned out to be far simpler than she had once feared. The work itself, done thoroughly and honestly, eventually spoke louder than any single person's attempt to diminish it. She offered a small, genuine smile, the first true smile anyone had seen from her since stepping into the building that morning, and told the young attorney that she should never allow another person to decide where she belonged, that the only opinion capable of determining her place in this profession was her own steady commitment to doing the work with integrity. The young woman nodded, visibly moved, unable to find words equal to the moment, and simply thanked her once more before turning toward the parking structure across the street. Judge Brooks watched her go for a moment, then continued down the corridor and out into the evening light, her silhouette growing smaller against the courthouse steps until she disappeared into the city beyond, just another figure moving through the crowd, indistinguishable to anyone who had not witnessed what she had accomplished only hours earlier. The story of that single morning would continue circulating for weeks afterward, retold in law offices and legal publications, discussed among attorneys who had never set foot in that particular courtroom, but who recognized in it something universally familiar: the timeless tension between assumption and truth, between the confidence people project and the substance that ultimately determines whether that confidence is deserved. Richard Calloway's case before the disciplinary board would unfold slowly over the following months. The details of witness tampering and falsified documents, drawing scrutiny that extended far beyond this single proceeding, opening questions about other cases he had handled in years past, cases that suddenly seemed worth re-examining in light of what had been uncovered. Former clients and opposing counsel alike coming forward with their own accounts of conduct they had once been too intimidated to formally report. Within a year, his license would be suspended pending a full review. The name that had once carried such weight in legal circles now attached primarily to the morning it all began to unravel. Diane Foster, though never formally implicated in his misconduct, found her own professional reputation quietly diminished, colleagues no longer seeking her counsel with the same eagerness. Her name now permanently linked in certain circles to the morning everything had unraveled, a reminder that silence in the face of cruelty rarely remains as neutral as it feels in the moment it is chosen. Judge Amara Brooks, meanwhile, continued presiding over her courtroom with the same unwavering composure she had always carried, neither seeking attention for what had happened nor shying away from the cases that came before her. Each new docket approached with the same exhaustive preparation that had defined her entire career, long before that morning made her name briefly familiar beyond legal circles. She never spoke publicly about the incident beyond the official record, never gave interviews or made statements designed to capitalize on the attention her story had received, declining more than one request from journalists eager to turn her into a symbol, rather than simply allowing her to continue the work she had always done. She understood, perhaps better than anyone else in that building, that dignity was never something granted by a title or a robe. It was something built quietly, over years of discipline and patience, revealed most clearly, not in moments of triumph, but in moments of humiliation, in the choice to respond to cruelty, not with anger, but with the steady, unshakable pursuit of what was right. Long after the footage had stopped circulating and the headlines had moved on to other stories, the courtroom on the fourth floor of that building continued operating exactly as it always had, attorneys arriving each morning with their arguments prepared, witnesses called and questioned, evidence weighed with the same careful attention regardless of who stood at the podium presenting it. As the courthouse lights dimmed that evening, and the building settled into its nightly quiet, the lesson of that single morning remained, etched into the memory of everyone who had witnessed it, a reminder that true authority is never announced. It is simply revealed, in the calm that remains when everything else falls away.